America has no shortage of buildings with histories dark enough to make the walls feel like they remember. Some of them are open for business. Some are locked down, fenced off, condemned, or privately owned by people who would very much prefer you stayed away. Here are the 15 most haunted buildings in America you're not supposed to visit. Number 15, Waverly Hills Sanatorium, Louisville, Kentucky. Waverly Hills opened in 1910 on a hill outside Louisville, Kentucky, as a tuberculosis sanatorium, one of the most ambitious such facilities in the country at a time when tuberculosis was killing Americans faster than almost anything else. The building that stands today, completed in 1926, is a massive Gothic structure with a distinctive bat-winged silhouette that manages to look precisely as ominous as its history suggests. At its peak, Waverly Hills housed hundreds of tuberculosis patients in an era before antibiotics, when the primary treatment options were rest, fresh air, experimental surgery, and waiting to see what happened. Claimed death counts at the facility have ranged wildly over the years. Figures of 60,000 or higher circulated for decades and have proven to be exaggerated. Historians who have examined surviving records estimate the actual number at closer to 8,000 deaths over the facility's operational years, with 1945 being the deadliest single year at 152 deaths. 8,000 is still a significant number of people to die in one building. The most documented architectural feature of Waverly Hills is the Body Chute, a 500-foot underground tunnel running from the building to the base of the hill, built to allow staff to remove the dead without the living patients watching the body count accumulate. The tunnel still exists. It is one of several elements of the building's design that was shaped directly by the scale of death occurring within it. Waverly Hills closed as a tuberculosis sanatorium in 1961, when antibiotic treatment had finally rendered such facilities obsolete. It briefly reopened as a geriatric hospital before closing permanently in the 1980s. The building sat derelict for years before being purchased by a private group that now manages it as a paranormal tourism destination. Tours are offered, though access to certain parts of the building remains restricted due to structural conditions. The building is not hard to visit, but the condition it is in makes parts of it genuinely unsafe to enter. Number 14, the LaLaurie Mansion, New Orleans, Louisiana. The LaLaurie Mansion at 1140 Royal Street in New Orleans, French Quarter, is one of the most documented sites of historical atrocity in American history, which is a distinction that comes with a particular kind of weight. The mansion was the home of Madame Delphine LaLaurie, a wealthy New Orleans socialite in the 1830s. In April 1834, a fire broke out at the property, and when rescuers responded, they found enslaved people chained in a hidden torture chamber in the attic who had been subjected to prolonged, systematic abuse. Others had clearly been killed there. The discovery provoked an immediate public response. A mob gathered and ransacked the mansion. LaLaurie fled New Orleans and is believed to have escaped to France, where she died without facing legal consequences for what had occurred in her home. The full extent of what happened in the LaLaurie Mansion was never subject to a legal accounting because the people who suffered there had no legal standing in 1834 Louisiana. The mansion has changed hands multiple times over the subsequent 190 years and is currently privately owned. It is not open to the public. It sits in one of the most heavily touristed neighborhoods in New Orleans and is a regular stop on ghost tour routes where visitors stop on the sidewalk and look up at the exterior. Actor Nicolas Cage owned the property briefly in the mid-2000s before losing it to foreclosure. The building has been reported to be haunted by the people who suffered within its walls, and whatever one believes about the paranormal, the factual history of what occurred there is disturbing enough to stand independently of any supernatural interpretation. Number 13, Eastern State Penitentiary, Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. Eastern State Penitentiary in Philadelphia opened in 1829 and pioneered the Pennsylvania system of total solitary confinement, in which inmates were hooded when outside their cells, isolated from all human contact, and expected to achieve penitence through silent reflection. What it actually produced in many inmates was psychological breakdown. Charles Dickens visited in 1842 and described the experience of solitary confinement there as torture. The prison operated until 1971. The building is architecturally striking, a Gothic fortress designed by John Haviland, with a radial plan of cell blocks emanating from a central rotunda. It held over 75,000 inmates over its 142-year history, including Al Capone, who served 8 months there in 1929, and Willie Sutton. The deteriorating cell blocks, with their crumbling ceilings, peeling plaster, and vegetation growing through the floors, are among the most photographed examples of institutional ruin in the country. Eastern State is now a museum and operates daytime tours year-round, along with a popular seasonal haunted attraction called Terror Behind the Walls each fall. Certain sections of the building remain structurally unsafe and are not accessible to visitors. Paranormal investigators have worked the facility extensively. Whether the reports of apparitions in the isolation cells and cell block 7 carry any weight beyond the power of suggestion in a place with this particular history is a question each visitor answers for themselves. Number 12. North Brother Island, New York City, New York. North Brother Island sits in the East River between the Bronx and Rikers Island, and it is one of the most peculiar pieces of restricted property in the United States. The island is accessible only by water, is not served by any public ferry, and access is formally prohibited except under specific research or professional circumstances. It is an abandoned island in the middle of one of the most densely populated cities in the world, and it has been that way for over 50 years. The island was home to Riverside Hospital from 1885, a quarantine facility for people with contagious diseases. Typhoid Mary, Mary Mallon, the first person in the United States officially identified as an asymptomatic carrier of typhoid fever, was quarantined on North Brother Island twice, dying there in 1938. The island also housed returning World War II veterans and later became a rehabilitation center for heroin addicts in the 1950s and 1960s that was eventually shut down amid reports of staff corruption and patient abuse. The island is now officially a bird sanctuary managed by the New York City Department of Parks and Recreation, which maintains the no-access policy specifically to protect the nesting herons. The buildings from the hospital and rehabilitation era remain on the island in various states of collapse. The trees have grown through the rooftops, and the vegetation has largely reclaimed the structures. Photographs taken by the rare researchers or journalists who have obtained permission to visit show an urban ruin unlike anything else in the city, in which nature has reasserted itself so completely that the buildings look as though they have been there for centuries rather than decades. Number 11. The Winchester Mystery House, San Jose, California. Sarah Winchester, widow of William Wirt Winchester of the Winchester Repeating Arms Company, began building her house in San Jose in 1884 and did not stop until her death in 1922. What she built, over 38 years of continuous construction employing workers around the clock, is a 24,000 square foot Victorian mansion with 160 rooms, stairways that lead into ceilings, doors that open onto walls, windows set into floors, and a spatial logic that defies conventional architectural reasoning. The most commonly cited explanation for the house's bizarre design is that Winchester was advised by a medium that she needed to continuously build to appease the spirits of people killed by Winchester rifles, and that she must never complete the house because completion would mean her own death. Winchester herself slept in a different bedroom each night, reportedly to prevent the spirits from finding her. Whether these explanations are accurate or whether they represent a convenient narrative applied to an eccentric woman's architectural obsessions is a question that historians have debated without resolution. The Winchester Mystery House is now a museum and offers multiple tour options to the public. What is not accessible to visitors, and what makes the house genuinely disorienting even on a guided tour, is the full labyrinthine interior. There are rooms within rooms, sealed passages, and sections of the house that were walled off during construction and have not been opened since. A 2016 earthquake revealed a previously unknown sealed room containing a pump organ, a Victorian couch, and a sewing machine. Whatever is behind the walls that have never been opened is unknown by definition. which is a detail that the Winchester Mystery House wears comfortably. Number 10. The Iroquois Theater, Chicago, Illinois, Nederlander Theater site. The site of what is now the Nederlander Theater in Chicago's Loop District was, in December 1903, the Iroquois Theater, and the site of the deadliest single-building fire in American history. The Iroquois had opened only 5 weeks earlier, on November 23, 1903. On December 30th, during a packed holiday matinee performance, an arc light overheated and ignited a stage curtain. The fire spread through the theater with extraordinary speed. The death toll was 602 people. Many were burned where they sat. Others rushed the exits, only to find that many of the doors were bolted from the outside, a design intended to prevent non-ticket holders from entering that trapped people inside during the fire. Others attempted to jump from rear fire escapes and fell to their deaths in the alley below. The alley behind the theater became known as Death Alley. It still carries that name informally. The building was renovated and reopened as the Colonial Theater in 1904 and has operated under several names since, becoming the Nederlander in 2000. The theater is a functioning venue today, not restricted in the sense of being closed to the public, but the alley behind it, Death Alley, is not a place that contemporary signage invites visitors to spend time. Staff at the theater over many decades have reported persistent experiences of unexplained sounds, cold spots, and a sense of presence, particularly in the upper balcony areas where many of the deaths occurred. The building remembers what happened there in a way that a renovation cannot fully erase. Number 9. Myrtles Plantation, St. Francisville, Louisiana. The Myrtles Plantation in St. Francisville, Louisiana, operates as a bed and breakfast and offers tours, which puts it in the category of places you can technically visit. But it occupies a particular place on this list because of the specific character of what it asks visitors to engage with. The plantation was built around 1796 by General David Bradford and has a documented history that includes multiple violent deaths on the property. The most widely repeated legend of the Myrtles involves Chloe, an enslaved woman on the plantation who was accused of poisoning the family of plantation owner Clark Woodruff, killing his wife and 2 daughters. The historical documentation for this specific story is disputed by some researchers, but the plantation does have a confirmed history of violent deaths, including the 1871 shooting of plantation resident William Winter, who was killed on the front porch by an unknown assailant and died on the 17th step of the main staircase, according to historical accounts. His phantom footsteps, reportedly heard climbing the stairs and stopping at the 17th step, are among the most specific and consistently reported phenomena at the property. The plantation is reportedly built on a tunica burial ground, which adds another layer to its history. The room that is most consistently reported as active is the Chloe Room. The French doors in the main house are original to the building and show what guides identify as handprints that cannot be removed by cleaning. An unusual physical detail in a place where the supernatural history is otherwise entirely testimonial. Number 8. Villisca Axe Murder House, Villisca, Iowa. The Villisca Axe Murder House is exactly what its name says it is. On the night of June 9th to 10th, 1912, 8 people were murdered in their beds in a house at 508 East 2nd Street in Villisca, Iowa. The victims were Josiah and Sarah Moore, their 4 children, and 2 additional children who had been staying the night. All 8 were killed with an axe. The crime was never solved. No one was ever convicted. The house is privately owned and is now offered for overnight stays and tours to people who want to spend time in the building where an unsolved mass murder of 6 children occurred. That sentence contains everything you need to know about the American supernatural tourism market, and probably a few things about human psychology more broadly. The physical evidence of the crime was thoroughly documented at the time and has been extensively studied since. The murder weapon was found inside the house. The killer was never identified. Suspects over the years included a traveling minister, a local businessman, and various transients, and the case generated 2 criminal trials, both of which ended in acquittals or mistrials. The murders remain officially unsolved after more than a century. Paranormal investigators who have spent time at the Villisca house report sounds consistent with children, unexplained movement of objects, and a general atmospheric disturbance that even skeptics describe as oppressive. Whether that is the weight of the actual history concentrated in a small, preserved space or something more, the house itself is a genuine piece of American criminal history sitting in a small Iowa town where it has never been fully explained. Number 7. The Lemp Mansion, St. Louis, Missouri. The Lemp Mansion in St. Louis is associated with the Lemp family, who built one of the most successful brewing dynasties in 19th century America, and then destroyed themselves in one of the more documented examples of concentrated family tragedy in American history. The Lemp Brewing Company was among the largest in the United States before Prohibition. The family mansion at 3322 Demonil Place was their home. Between 1904 and 1949, 4 members of the Lemp family died by suicide inside the mansion. William Lemp Sr. shot himself in his office in the mansion in 1904, following the death of his close friend and business associate Frederick Popst. His son William Jr. shot himself in the mansion's office in 1922, after Prohibition had effectively destroyed the family's business. A daughter, Elsa Lemp Wright, who had left the family home, died by suicide in 1920. A second son, Charles, shot himself in the mansion in 1949, reportedly after first shooting his dog. The building was subsequently sold, briefly used as a boarding house, and eventually converted to its current use as a restaurant and inn. The Lemp Mansion is open to the public as a restaurant and offers overnight stays in a building that is, objectively, the site of multiple deaths over a short period. St. Louis Magazine writer Marcia Poole, who wrote about the mansion in the 1980s, described the building as having a palpable atmosphere of unease that she attributed less to supernatural causes than to the concentrated weight of the family's history. The mansion's basement, where the family brewery's cave system connected to the property, is the area most consistently reported as uncomfortable by visitors and staff alike. Number 6. The Stanley Hotel, Estes Park, Colorado. The Stanley Hotel opened in 1909 in Estes Park, Colorado, built by Freeland Oscar Stanley, co-inventor of the Stanley Steamer automobile, as a luxury resort for wealthy guests seeking the mountain air of the Colorado Rockies. Stanley and his wife Flora reportedly loved the hotel so thoroughly that they never quite left. Or at least, that is the most commonly offered explanation for the activity in room 217 and elsewhere in the building. Stephen King spent one night at the Stanley in 1974 with his wife Tabitha in room 217 and reportedly experienced such a vivid set of nightmares that he spent the sleepless remainder of the night writing the opening pages of what became The Shining. The hotel is not shy about this connection. Room 217 is consistently booked months in advance, and the Stanley has built a significant part of its brand around its association with King's novel and Stanley Kubrick's 1980 film adaptation, which was not actually filmed there. A gas explosion in room 217 in 1911, before King's visit by some decades, injured a chambermaid named Elizabeth Wilson, who survived and continued working at the hotel until 1950. Wilson is among the most reported presences in the building. Staff and guests describe finding their belongings moved and their beds made by unseen hands, particularly in room 217. The hotel's 4th floor, where the ballroom is located, generates a persistent volume of reports involving children's voices, which is a detail that most guests at a functioning luxury resort find more unsettling than charming. The Stanley is fully operational and welcomes visitors. It is on this list because several parts of it appear to welcome visitors, whether they know it or not. Number 5. Bachelor's Grove Cemetery, Midlothian, Illinois. Bachelor's Grove Cemetery in Midlothian, Illinois, is one of the most studied locations in American paranormal research and one of the more deteriorated small cemeteries in the country. The cemetery, which sits in a forest preserve southwest of Chicago, was established in the 1830s and was in active use until the mid-20th century. It has been officially closed to visitors for decades, though the path leading to it remains technically accessible and is used regularly by researchers, photographers, and curious visitors who are technically trespassing. The cemetery contains approximately 200 graves, many with markers that have been stolen or vandalized over the years. The deterioration of the cemetery is significant enough that even the boundaries of the burial ground are unclear in places. The small lagoon adjacent to the cemetery has a history of use as a dumping ground during Chicago's Prohibition era that makes its contents a subject of speculation. The access road that once served the cemetery was closed decades ago, leaving the site accessible only on foot through the forest preserve. The volume of photographic anomalies reportedly documented at Bachelor's Grove is unusual by any standard. The most famous image, taken by Mari Huff of the Ghost Research Society in 1991, appears to show a semi-transparent woman in period clothing seated on a gravestone. The photograph has been examined and has not been definitively explained as a double exposure or deliberate fabrication. It is not proof of anything. It is, however, an image that has circulated for over 30 years without a clean debunking, which is more than can be said for most paranormal photographs. The cemetery is restricted. That restriction is regularly ignored. The cemetery itself does not appear to mind. Number 4. Whaley House, San Diego, California. The Whaley House at 2476 San Diego Avenue is the oldest brick building in Southern California and one of the most formally studied haunted buildings in the country. It was built in 1857 by Thomas Whaley, a prominent San Diego merchant, on a site that had been used as a public gallows. A man known as Yankee Jim Robinson had been hanged there in 1852, badly, by accounts that described a prolonged strangulation rather than a clean execution, and Whaley had witnessed it. He then bought the property and built his family home on it. The Whaley family began reporting unexplained heavy footsteps shortly after moving in. Their youngest daughter, Violet, lived in the house until 1953 and maintained throughout her life that Yankee Jim's ghost was audibly present. The California Department of Parks and Recreation designated the Whaley House as an official haunted house, one of only 2 buildings in California to hold that designation, which means the state government of California has formally acknowledged that something unusual is associated with the property. The house is a museum operated by the Save Our Heritage organization and is open for tours, though certain areas of the house are not accessible to general visitors. Hans Holzer, the Austrian-American parapsychologist who studied the building extensively in the 1960s, stated that the Whaley House was among the genuine cases he had encountered in his research, a characterization that carries the weight it carries depending on how much credit you extend to parapsychological research. The footsteps are what the house's history returns to most consistently: heavy, boot-heeled, climbing the stairs of a building constructed on ground where a man died badly a century and a half ago. Number 3. Trans-Allegheny Lunatic Asylum, Weston, West Virginia. The Trans-Allegheny Lunatic Asylum in Weston, West Virginia, is the largest hand-cut stone building in North America and one of the most intact examples of the Kirkbride Plan, a 19th-century architectural philosophy for psychiatric hospitals that emphasized light, ventilation, and a therapeutic environment. The theory was humane. The practice, over the institution's operational life from 1864 to 1994, was rather different. The asylum was designed for 250 patients. By the mid-20th century, it was housing over 2,400. The overcrowding produced conditions that resulted in the kinds of institutional failures that characterized American psychiatric care in the post-war period: inadequate staffing, physical abuse, experimental treatments, and deaths under circumstances that were not always fully documented. The building's history includes everything from Civil War use as a military post to documented patient deaths across 130 years of operation that, in several cases, were never fully investigated. The asylum was purchased by private owners in 2007 and is now open for historical tours and paranormal investigations. which represents the standard second act for large, architecturally distinctive, historically troubled institutional buildings in the American Rust Belt. Certain sections of the building are structurally compromised and are not accessible on standard tours. The isolation ward, the part of the building where the most difficult patients were housed, generates the most consistent reports from paranormal investigators working the facility. One investigator who worked the building for a documentary production described the isolation ward as producing the most sustained and reproducible anomalous readings she had encountered in over a decade of similar work. Number 2. The Amityville Horror House, Amityville, New York. The house at 112 Ocean Avenue in Amityville, New York, is privately owned, occupied by people who are not interested in public attention, and has had its distinctive boathouse-style dormer windows removed and its address changed specifically to discourage the steady stream of curious visitors who have made the residents' lives difficult for decades. The house is not open to the public. It is not on any official historical register. It is a residential property that the current owners would very much like to be left alone. On November 13, 1974, Ronald DeFeo Jr. shot and killed 6 members of his family, his parents and 4 siblings, in the house while they slept. DeFeo was convicted of 6 counts of second-degree murder in 1975 and died in prison in 2021. The following year, George and Kathy Lutz purchased the house and moved in with their children. 28 days later, they left. The account they subsequently gave of their time in the house, described in Jay Anson's 1977 book and subsequently in multiple film adaptations, described a sustained series of paranormal events of escalating intensity. The accuracy of the Lutz account has been disputed extensively, with some investigators arguing that significant elements were fabricated for commercial purposes. What is not disputed is the DeFeo murders, which actually happened in that house and are fully documented. The forensic and legal record of what DeFeo did in those rooms on November 13, 1974, is established in court documents that do not require any supernatural component to be deeply disturbing. The house's subsequent history, as one of the most recognizable addresses in American supernatural culture, has obscured the actual crime at its center, which deserves to be understood on its own terms, rather than as the backstory to a haunting narrative. Number 1. Poveglia Island, Venice, Italy, and its American equivalent. Hart Island, New York City, New York. Hart Island in Long Island Sound, just off the northeastern tip of the Bronx, is the largest publicly funded cemetery in the world and one of the most restricted pieces of land in New York City. Access to the island has historically been controlled by the New York City Department of Correction, which used Rikers Island inmates as the burial workforce. Family members of people buried on Hart Island have been denied access to their relatives' graves for decades, a restriction that has generated ongoing legal challenges and advocacy campaigns. The island has served as a burial ground for New York City's unclaimed and indigent dead since 1869. Approximately 1 million people are buried there in mass graves, a word count that is worth sitting with for a moment. 1 million. The island also has a history that includes a Civil War prisoner of war camp, a potter's field, a tuberculosis pavilion, a facility for people with mental illness, a drug rehabilitation program, and a Nike missile battery during the Cold War. It is a location that has absorbed virtually every category of New York City's discarded history in physical form. In 2021, the management of Hart Island was transferred from the Department of Correction to the Parks Department, and a limited public access program was initiated. Ferries to the island began operating on a restricted schedule, allowing family members of the interred to visit specific sections. Access to most of the island remains prohibited. The ruins of the structures from the island's various institutional eras remain standing in various states of deterioration among the grave markers. Hart Island is the most haunted place in America, not because of any documented supernatural activity, but because of the sheer concentration of forgotten human lives it contains, and because the city that produced those lives spent over a century making it as difficult as possible for anyone to remember them. If this one stayed with you, hit that like button and subscribe. These buildings have more to say than anyone officially on record is willing to repeat.